Adam Wordsworth.
And I'm Juan Francisco Muñoz, and this is the Geopolitical Pickle.
Disinformation is all around us. It's hard to go on social media these days without being inundated with people trying to manipulate our points of view using a variety of different tricks. That's why we thought it was essential to bring this series to air and explain the risks and the potential remedies against disinformation.
Disinformation Project is a 5-episode podcast where we will be exploring, with experts in the field, the effects of disinformation in the African continent, as well as its development and what are the tools used to spread this disinformation. Thank you very much for listening. We hope you enjoy the show.
Okay, welcome to the Geopolitical Pickle. It's our great honor today to have our guest Mark Duerksen from the Center for African Strategic Studies. Mark, thank you again, and would you mind introducing yourself first of all?
Thanks so much for having me. It's an honor. As you mentioned, I'm a researcher and the strategic communications lead at the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, based at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., where we track and analyze African security issues. The center has been around for about 25 years, and our topic for today, disinformation, is something we've been really trying to grapple with and understand going back 5-10 years now. So excited for the conversation.
First of all, thank you for being here. If we can start a little bit by understanding what is misinformation, what is disinformation, is there a difference? You could give us an introduction there.
Sure. It's a good place to start. So for us, what we really focus on is sophisticated, coordinated disinformation campaigns. And kind of the definition we've settled on for thinking about disinformation is the intentional dissemination of false or misleading information, and that is often or almost always spread through the weaponization and the manipulation of some of the new digital and social media spaces that we're really seeing proliferate in Africa. And disinformation is used to advance political objectives. It's very, as I mentioned, it's purposeful, it's intentional, and that really is what distinguishes it from misinformation. Misinformation is unintentional. It's when somebody, doesn't know that something is false or misleading and might share it or pass it on to their networks. So it's much more innocuous, but oftentimes misinformation, kind of misconceptions, misunderstandings, can be a big amplifier of disinformation. And honestly, it's what disinformation preys on, that people will amplify and spread some of these purposely false narratives.
And could you tell us a little bit how has it evolved? Obviously, you've written about social media and source of the like, but where does it come from? How has it evolved recently?
Sure. So really, there's been quite a bit of change on the African continent in the past 10, 15 years. It's really been a remarkable transformation in terms of the continent's information ecosystems. Going back 10, 15 years ago, radio, newspapers, were mouth-to-mouth conversations, were how information was spread and disseminated. And what we've seen in the last 10 years is just this remarkable expansion of cell phones, of internet connectivity, of social media, popularity on the continent. Going back to 2016, there was less than 100 million everyday social media users on the continent. That number is now over 400 million people. So it's just been, it's really it's been transformative for the flows, the circuits of information on the continent. And at the same time, we've seen external actors, increasingly domestic actors, kind of see this, some of the vulnerabilities that have been associated with this really fast-paced transformation, and seeing openings to kind of insert themselves into these new flows of information, to divert them, to manipulate them, to reshape them, kind of to spread disinformation and to advance these political objectives.
Just to pick up there, so you obviously mentioned different actors and their realization of the ways maybe to weaponize it. I wanted to touch on how specifically a few different actors use disinformation across Africa. If we look at China, I know they have gone more traditionally into like the old media space in terms of TV, print, and different publications. Whereas from what I understand for Russia, they're much more targeted to the social media. How is that to differentiate? Is China now moving into the social media space as well? And what are the different sort of activities to do?
Yeah, I think you've hit it on the head. We do see that the majority of these kind of large-scale systematic disinformation campaigns are emanating, for the most part, from foreign actors. There are a number of domestic political actors involved as well, but Russia's the big one. Russia is connected to over 40% of the campaigns on the continent. In some of our analysis, we've tracked over 189 different disinformation campaigns targeting the continent, and Russia's been connected to 80 of those. China's connected to a handful as well, but as you said, you're hitting it on the nose that China is much more, at the moment, invested in kind of institutionalized ways to shape media narratives, to shape coverage of China's activities in Africa. So that's through media licensing agreements, ownership of media companies in Africa, and control and kind of construction contracts around ICT infrastructure. Whereas Russia is very heavily kind of concentrated on social media spaces, digital communication channels, but having a whole toolkit to kind of operate in those spaces, involving Russian state media outlets, increasingly working with local influencers and African kind of media groups and marketing groups. So there is a distinction between kind of how the two actors are seeking to shape some of the narratives and information environments on the continent. But increasingly, we are seeing Chinese attempts to kind of get involved in the social media space as well, to set up these coordinated bot armies that are amplifying Chinese state media, that are amplifying Chinese embassies. And so and this has kind of been part of a global trend that's been noticed, that China has been more aggressive in trying to develop kind of a Russian-style disinformation and manipulation of these social media spaces.
As you've mentioned, Russia is the actor that has been more active, or at least has developed it for a longer period. Can we see where disinformation and then political results on the ground? As for example, comes out of the top of my head now with the coups in the Sahel, for example, that have had a really strong pro-Russian and anti-French component. Is this correlated with then these disinformation campaigns that you investigate?
Yeah, I think that we can pretty definitively draw a correlation between where we are seeing concentrations of disinformation and where we're seeing instability on the continent. We are seeing disinformation campaigns being tied directly to incidences of violent riots in places like the DRC. In Cameroon, we're seeing disinformation, kind of the doxing of people online, being connected to executions and political violence around the Anglophone crisis there. We're seeing in Sudan, where there's a civil war currently, that disinformation is really increasing kind of the fog of war and the uncertainty for civilians who are trying to stay out of harm's way. But to your mentioning of the Sahel and kind of what we've seen with this string of coups and the rise of military rule there, in each of those instances, going back to Mali in 2020, followed by Guinea, Burkina Faso, Niger, there really has been a kind of softening of the ground for these coups by really quite widespread disinformation tied to Russian actors like the Wagner Group that were helping to kind of preying on really a lot of the grievances, a lot of the dissatisfaction in the region, a lot of the political, security, economic problems. And then as these coups unfolded for a variety of reasons, factions of the military seeing an opening to grab power, these networks cheerleaded that tried to connect those specific military leaders to Russia, tried to kind of paint that this was, to the benefit of Russia, and that this was kind of a surge of pro-Russian actions that we were seeing happen, and now has really tried to consolidate this and tried to paint this narrative as this this groundswell of support for Russia, this turn against the West, when we have seen it really just be, it's hard to, when you're talking about a military coup, you're talking about the actions of a few people in oftentimes mid-level officers who are seizing power, but Russia's really used disinformation to paint this as a broader story about the popularity of Russia on the continent, of the successes that these coups are having, and we have seen it be incredibly destabilizing for the region, where insecurity is on the rise, the economic indicators of these countries are plummeting, journalists are being, and opposition figures are being attacked, they're being silenced, and yet disinformation has kind of clouded the whole picture of what is happening and convinced a lot of people that this is a positive development for the continent.
I think you touched on a fair bit there, but just to go into maybe some more details, like what are the geopolitical reasons potentially that the state, specifically Russia, I guess, but more than increasingly China as well, might engage in this level of disinformation campaigns? I mean, yeah, you did say some of it there, but to go into more detail about what the specific goals would be.
Sure. I think it's helpful to kind of circle back and to look at this story over the 10 years that I was mentioning, that we've seen this really remarkable transformation of Africa's information spaces. And going back to 2017, 2018, we start to see some of these Russian disinformation actors showing up on the continent. They had been heavily involved in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. A number of kind of the Prigozhin, Wagner network, including the Internet Research Agency from St. Petersburg, were indicted by the FBI. They popped back up in Africa, in Mozambique, in Madagascar, Libya, Sudan, Mali, and they seem to be almost have an incoherent kind of approach to what they're doing. They're trying a lot of different tactics. They're setting up pages with kind of different styles of content. They're in some cases backing multiple parties or individuals running for elections in places like Madagascar. In Sudan, they're backing multiple actors in the civil war there. And so it's kind of confusing what's happening, but what it seems like was that they were throwing kind of a lot against the wall and seeing what stuck. They were seeing kind of where there were soft spots, where there were vulnerabilities, where there was grievances that could be, kind of exploited, where kind of local issues could be inflamed and where polarization could be driven, kind of where a Russian network could be groomed. And we saw this really stick in the Sahel, especially. We saw that some of the narratives that Russia was spreading around anti-France, anti-West grievances against the democratically elected governments in those countries, they found a soft spot and they really doubled down on pushing that type of content and doing it in really oftentimes sophisticated ways where it seems like they were reading the analytics, the metrics. They were seeing what was being shared, what was popular, and then they were producing more of that type of content, often humorous, oftentimes with a kernel of truth. But they started to find a lot of success in the Sahel, and really what it's clear that how this advanced Russia's political objectives was that it allowed Russia, one, to kind of project that it had friends in Africa, that Russia was still popular in parts of the world, especially in the lead up to the invasion of Ukraine, in the aftermath of that. Second, by spreading these anti-democratic messages, by attacking the governments in these countries, Russia was helping to undermine democracy in Africa and has done so in 19 different African countries. And that is part of a project that really Russia has pursued globally of trying to, legitimize its own domestic anti-democratic credentials by kind of normalizing that around the world. And then third, by sponsoring these campaigns that were really preying on grievances, and by channeling those grievances into really disillusionment, into a type of cynicism, even, I think we can even describe it as some of the content and kind of tenor of the disinformation that Russia was spreading is really kind of a nihilism, and using that to kind of drive instability, to kind of sponsor and spur kind of a destructive type of politics that leads to military coups, that leads to militarism. And Russia really thrives where there is that type of destabilization, where isolated and really unpopular regimes come into power, in that Russia finds kind of a natural partner with those regimes that they can offer kind of a package of services to. It will help sponsor disinformation to kind of muddy the narrative, to kind of project that you're popular, that we're popular, to distract from any kind of corruption we'll be engaged in. And then also the kind of this other package of irregular channels of influence, mercenaries, election meddling, and just kind of use this destabilization to help bring about kind of this political landscape now where there are military regimes, isolated regimes in power who have turned to Russia kind of as their partner of choice.
Going a little bit into the project that you are involved with the Africa Center of Strategic Studies, the mapping the Surge of Disinformation in Africa, we'd like to ask you a little bit the history of the project, how did it started, what have been the findings, and a little bit later, what tools do you use? How do you map it? How do you recognize disinformation campaigns? A little bit.
Sure. So this project, mapping a surge of disinformation in Africa, was a multi-year effort to track and analyze all of the publicly documented disinformation campaigns targeting Africa. And this is the second time we'd done this analysis. The first time was in 2022. And so now in 2024, 2 years later, what we saw was there's been a fourfold increase in the number of these campaigns present in Africa. They're affecting every region of the continent, at least 39 countries. As I mentioned, Russia is the primary sponsor of these campaigns, connected to over 80 of the 189 campaigns documented. And really where this research comes from, this is kind of a meta-analysis where this is all based on reports and articles that have been published, including by over 30 African researchers and organizations. So really a lot of this concern, a lot of this alarm is starting to come from people who this is their information ecosystem. They're seeing it infiltrated. They're seeing it. They're seeing their friends and colleagues and family driven into these kind of media silos. They see people on their WhatsApp groups spreading, conspiracies and false information, and they're alarmed by this. They're researching it. They're trying to understand it, trying to understand who's behind it. And in the report, we include a downloadable chart that includes documentation for all 189 of these campaigns. And it kind of plots out the actors behind each campaign, what their objectives are, some of the tactics that they're using, the type of content they're spreading, and then what we know about the kind of the scale of each campaign and the impact that it's actually had.
I think, looking at your map, obviously the Sahel is by far the number one targeted zone, but I think also it's probably the most researched zone at the moment as well because of the potential geopolitical changes that are going on there as a result of some of these campaigns. But then looking forward, I think we see already that there's new regions, new frontiers being looked at to turn towards Russia. I mean, that aren't even necessarily having any documented misinformation campaigns already. So I think the scale then is just going to keep growing. I guess, as you said, it's a meta-analysis. So you guys aren't on the ground necessarily conducting research. But if you look in some of the Gulf of Guinea, West African countries that are now geopolitically potentially aligning themselves closer to Russia, there's no documented campaigns there. So do you think, how comprehensive do you think then that the data is that you have when you look at countries such as Equatorial Guinea, Sao Tome and Principe, which are turning towards Russia, which I would think have had some level of Russian information going on there prior to this governmental shift?
Yeah, it's a good question, and as we note in the report, it's surely an undercount of what is happening, and it is dependent on kind of I think where we've seen disinformation be the most destabilizing. That's where it has attracted the research so far. And a lot of these countries are, we don't have a good sense of what is going on in their information spaces. This research is quite technical often. It takes training and, types of tools and software that aren't widely available currently. So there's as some of the researchers we've talked to have mentioned that almost any time they go looking in an African information space, once they start combing through Facebook pages, they find disinformation. They find networks spreading disinformation. So it's quite possible that what is documented here is really just the tip of a much deeper iceberg, but we just don't know because there hasn't been enough research yet, especially in, as you mentioned, some of the Lusophone countries, Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, Guinea-Bissau. There is very little research being done in those places, so it is kind of a black hole.
And I think just building on that, because potentially this proliferation has been so massive across the continent. And I mean, I think even in Europe and in America, obviously we're not immune to being exposed to this level of disinformation targeted campaigns. I wanted to go now into some of maybe the practical ways which basically you can spot disinformation, how to make people aware of it, and then building on that, then how you can, if you actually have this media literacy yourself, explain to someone that maybe doesn't have the same level of media literacy, say your parents, say someone not so tech savvy, how you can spot it and then how you can help to process it.
Yeah, I think that's something that we're all grappling with. And the way we talk about it in kind of the framework that's being developed for countering disinformation starts with good information. It starts with having a better sense of the landscape of what are the networks out there that are spreading these falsehoods, that are trying to polarize and inflame conversations. What are some of the tactics they're using? So that takes sophisticated analytic tools. It takes kind of having a methodology for accessing this data, for analyzing it, for putting it in taxonomies that other researchers can understand and also use and build upon. So I think there's a lot of interest amongst African researchers, amongst African media monitoring NGOs to start doing more of this type of work. And then kind of once groups are armed with that kind of insight, that's then when you can start to develop more targeted kind of interventions, inoculations, when you can then use that to kind of concentrate. Okay, we see that this group is this demographic in this country seems to be really being hit hard by this disinformation campaign, this one narrative. What is then the best way to if you catch it early enough, pre-bunk it, or to fact check it, to get people good information in the moment. And there are really one of the things that's been inspiring is kind of this groundswell of interest, enthusiasm, and work being done on fact checking in Africa. There are in almost every country, there's several fact-checking organizations. There are Africa-wide networks of fact-checkers that are coordinating and making sure that they're using high standards of methods and kind of coordinating in terms of their fact-checking. And so then the next step is, how do you get that information to people? How do you meet people where they are? How do you, get this good information on social media? How do you take the fact checks and the insights about disinformation and use that to lobby and pressure social media companies? And this is where really the power of having these kind of collaborative networks comes into play, because you have to connect the research, the analysis, to the fact checking, to the strategic communication, to the pressure on social media companies, to the efforts to try and have some types of reputational costs for the sponsors of disinformation. So this really takes one group or one person can't do this. It really takes kind of these decentralized communities of practitioners, of researchers, of academics. And I think this is something we're starting to see form on the continent, but it really needs more resources. It needs more trainings, more coordination. But I think that is kind of the model that we're seeing. We've seen it work in the Baltics. We saw something similar in Sudan, actually deliver some results prior to the outbreak of civil war there. But but really just finding ways to empower citizens to regain some sense of ownership and sovereignty over their information spaces, and then start to set up kind of these protective measures to monitor those spaces and then react when disinformation is detected.
That brings me a question. I know that you were involved also with infographics, and you've actually got prizes because of that. Do you think that a more visual information, for example, or something that will be more accessible for the general public, is also a way not just to addressing the social media companies or whatever, but try and also go to the ones being affected by the disinformation, make it, I don't know, a little bit more simple, a little bit more clear, or just rethinking the way we're showing this information?
Absolutely. I think it's a topic that a lot of people struggle to understand because it's not always straightforward how disinformation works. People want to write about things that are true or false, but oftentimes disinformation is kind of blurring those lines, and kind of it's more contorting truth, or it's more oftentimes the real problem is that it's manipulating social media algorithms to silence certain voices and to dominate the conversation. And to push people out of conversations. And so I think because that can be hard for people to kind of wrap their heads around how that works in these invisible online spaces, they kind of dismiss it as, well, maybe this isn't so important, or maybe this is a distraction. So I think we do need better visualizations about how this process works, how these groups are actually changing the shape, kind of changing the narrative of what is happening in Africa, and how that's really displacing African voices, how that's really undercutting African sovereignty. So I think the more we can do to help visualize that, to help communicate that, the better. I think there's a lot that could be innovated in terms of kind of real-time dashboards that are tracking disinformation, that are empowering people to kind of understand the information in circulation and what they're consuming. We're seeing some of this. Really, South Africa is an example of where some of these tools have been built, where that there's a group called Media Monitoring Africa that is doing a lot of work around the election taking place right now, where they do have these types of dashboards that people can turn to, look at the media that they're consuming, and understand, are there biases in this media? Is there disinformation connected to what I've been reading? And it's really empowering for citizens in that way. But like I said, these efforts take resources, they take time, they take dedication, they take treating this problem seriously.
Yes, thank you very much for your time, Mark. It's been an absolute pleasure to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me.